The Death Mage Who Doesn't Want a Fourth Time. Chapter 49. The victory against the mid-boss was unfulfilling, but the dragon golem is next. Insectoid monsters have no ability to think and move solely on instinct. Upon hearing this, one might think that this would make it easier for tamers, such as those with the animal tamer skill, to control them. However, the reality is that their instincts are too powerful for humans to manipulate. There have been those who come up with ways to use special herbs, incense, and certain sounds to control them to a certain extent, but the final result was too unstable to be called taming. It was a dangerous method, where one mistake would end with the would-be tamers being eaten. And thus, the fact that insectoid monsters and undead cannot be tamed became widely known. "Is that how it's supposed to be?" Vandaloo asked after hearing Borkus's explanation. Buzzing. "It is," replied Borkus. More buzzing. "I find that hard to believe." Vandaloo had been captured by the countless cemetery bees and was now being carried around by them. They're so friendly, though. It apparently happened to be the time of year where the cemetery bees would change the location of their nest when Vandaloo had found them, and then they had been caught by his death attribute charm. There had been a previous incident where the undead in the dungeon were friendly towards Vandaloo, but he had not managed to tame them and bring them outside the dungeon back then. However, these bees had followed Vandaloo's party even down to the next floor. It was likely because the level of Vandaloo's death attribute charm skill had increased since back then. Or perhaps it was simply that cemetery bees were more compatible with Vandaloo. "Ghouls, vampires, and cemetery bees. This death attribute charm works on a lot more things than I thought," said Borkus. Cemetery bees were originally one of the types of monsters created by the Demon King to fight against humans and take over this world. It is possible that they were actually created by an evil god who rules over death. Either way, if death attribute charm levels up any further, it might be a good idea to start avoiding dungeons and devil's nests, where there are a lot of undead. It would be pandemonium if I was followed by hordes of undead each time I entered and exited such places. It might be an effective way to gather forces quickly, though.
"So, what are you going to do about that guy?"
asked Vigaro, pointing at the mid-boss on the 20th floor of Borkus's sub-dragon Savannah. The rank 6 venom wyvern spread the wings that were attached to its front limbs as it let out a roar. It was a wyvern that had grown older and increased its rank, becoming larger and evolving to gain the ability to secrete deadly venom from its claws and the enormous spike at the end of its tail. Its intelligence was still just at the level of being relatively intelligent for a beast, and it was still incapable of spitting some form of deadly breath. However, the speed and mobility of normal wyverns could not compare to those of the venom wyvern. It was said that it would be impossible even for C-class adventurers to defeat this monster in close-range combat without being able to fly themselves. "I'll try fighting it alone, just as we planned at the start." Vandaloo had been planning to use the mid-boss that appeared before the boss of Borkus's sub-dragon Savannah as a test for himself. Even if he leveled up and his attribute values increased, it would be meaningless if he couldn't put them to use in real battles. He wouldn't be able to confidently say that he had become strong enough to not be killed instantly by the dragon golem. For that purpose, he was to fight the venom wyvern one-on-one and see if he could defeat it. Of course, without using a mana absorption barrier to remove the mana from its wings and bring it to the ground. Of course, even if he was able to defeat the venom wyvern, there was still no guarantee that he would be able to avoid an instant death at the hands of the half-destroyed dragon golem. That dragon golem was overwhelmingly superior to the weak dragon that was currently flapping its wings threateningly in front of Vandaloo. Well, this is just to get an idea of how strong I am. I know I'm not going to gain any special abilities or anything from beating this mid-boss. If I win, I'll try going down to the dragon golem again, and if it's still not going to work out, I'll just have to come back and do more training.
Make sure you don't die, Borkus warned him.
Do your best, boy. Do not forget that we are all watching over you,
said Zadiris. Receiving this encouragement, Vandaloo stepped forward to challenge the venom wyvern on his own.
I failed this time, too,
said Vandaloo. Well, it can't be helped. I heard that C-class adventurers need to have a lot of talent or put in an incredible amount of hard work.
Vandaloo works hard for his age, but it's one-on-one. You're a tamer, so you don't need to worry about it, right?
After failing for the 5th time, Vandaloo had returned to Talosheim and was resting, while developing more weapons, making katsuboshi, and doing other various things. He was currently attending a meeting between Bilde and the other mothers who were busy raising their children, where ideas regarding childcare were being exchanged. He was also practicing death attribute magic at the same time. The food menu was mostly Japanese, consisting of miso soup containing katsuboshi and wild vegetables, acorn powder, udon, and auger soaked in honey for dessert. He had first tried making katsuboshi around this time last year, mass-producing failed products that had been made using a process based on his knowledge from Earth of over 20 years ago. But he had finally become able to make it successfully and reliably recently. I should have learned more about katsuboshi and smoking food. Well, I never imagined that I'd be making katsuboshi in another world. He had tried to connect the pieces of his vague knowledge of the process from television and whatnot, and executed it as best he could, producing large quantities of failures as a result. He had gotten the feeling that the fillets were supposed to be smoked near a charcoal fire, but it was likely that he remembered it incorrectly or the method he remembered was some kind of unorthodox one. As for the udon, it had been made using acorn flour that was smoother than wheat flour, with the eggs of the giga bird that Gorba had captured to bind the flour together. He had originally wanted to make ramen, but he had been unable to make lye water. Sodium carbonate and potassium carbonate are the main ingredients of lye water. In other words, it is a special kind of alkaline solution required to make ramen. Vandaloo was currently trying to think of ways that he might be able to make it. Even the spirits of the researchers in Origin that Vandaloo had listened to had not made their own lye water. He was trying to devise a method so he would likely be able to make it in a few years' time. Vandaloo had been surprised to learn that noodles did not exist in Lambda. There was no udon, soba, ramen, not even pasta. So when he had made his first udon, everyone's impressions had been something along the lines of, "This bread is quite long and thin. It is interesting that you've used boiling water to make it." Well, that was why spreading the Japanese custom of slurping when eating udon and soba seemed like it would be so fun. He had thought that there would be at least udon or pasta, but considering that there was no smoked food either, perhaps there were only simple foods and recipes in this world? Perhaps the reason was that the people had not had the freedom to invent them, or the fact that the delicious monster meat and produce could be obtained from devil's nests, eliminating the need to invent such food. And the agar used for the dessert was something that Vandaloo had made from tengusa, while the honey was, of course, from the cemetery bees. Vandaloo had tamed, or rather been forced to tame, the cemetery bees, who were now building an enormous nest in Talosheim's royal castle. Even though it was winter, worker bees were being sent into the devil's nest to produce honey. Incidentally, the cemetery bees mainly ate meat. There was no problem with giving them the meat of monsters that was not suitable for eating, such as that of goblins. The honey of the cemetery bees had a powerful scent and rich taste. The combination of agar with this honey had become very popular, with things like tengusa and kombu being major food ingredients. The inhabitants of Talosheim were forced to reconsider their opinions on the value of seaweed. They required effort to make, however, as they could not be created through the cast of a spell like miso and fish sauce. Come to think of it, Van, isn't it a bad idea to give honey to the children? Asked Bastia.
This is honey that has had everything harmful to the body removed, so there's no problem,
said Vandaloo. Vandaloo had used sterilization and disinfect to remove any components that could cause harm to the body from the honey while preserving its quality. It would be impossible for anyone to collapse from eating this honey, though he could not change the fact that one would gain weight if they ate too much of it.
So I suppose it's fine for them to eat.
The baby in her arms made a strange noise. But it's still too early for you to eat baby food, Jaddle. Bastia readjusted the way she was holding the baby, who was reaching a hand out towards a plate full of honey-covered fruit, so that the baby was further away from it. Jaddle was Bastia's daughter, who had been born towards the end of summer. Perhaps in return for Bastia having gone through so much trouble getting pregnant, the birth and delivery had been surprisingly straightforward. Now Jaddle was growing quickly. Her gray-brown, puffy cheeks were very adorable.
Jaddle-chan has grown big, hasn't she? Said one of the other mothers. Ah, are you trimming her claws properly?
No, it seems like she hasn't grown any yet, replied Bastia. When did Varby start growing them?
For Varby, I suppose it was just before she turned a year old. But sometimes they can grow as early as 3 months after they're born, so make sure you trim them properly. Children can hurt themselves with their own claws, after all, said another mother. Did that happen for you, King? Vandaloo started growing his claws after only 3 months, but he was already very smart by then, said Darcia. Really, smart at the age of 3 months? That's amazing. He was only a year old when he came to our village, so I think it's a bit late to be surprised.
Darcia was smiling as she joined in on the conversation between the ghoul mothers. She had only been visible to Vandaloo and the undead up until now, but now she was able to be seen by Bastia, Bilde, and the others, as well as converse with them, thanks to the visualization spell that Vandaloo had invented, though it did make her appear rather transparent. He had thought that Darcia would be less stressed if she could communicate with the others more smoothly, so he had created the spell with that in mind. Well, since it also made the whip marks and burns on her spirit visible, it would be difficult to use in human societies, unlike in Talosheim where everyone knew about her circumstances. Vandaloo wanted to resurrect her and make this spell useless before entering human societies. Meanwhile, Vandaloo was playing with the ghoul children nearby. Another of the ghoul babies made a noise. As ghoul boys had the heads of lions as soon as they were born, they looked just like kittens at this age. They didn't have paws, but they were very cute. Bone Man didn't seem to be able to deal with them, however. Vandaloo was really glad he had instructed him not to harm any cats without thinking.
"Papa? I'm not your papa,"
said Vandaloo. "I know you're really attached to me, but I'm not your papa. Let's make this very clear."
Nee. That's right. Nee is correct.
If by nee you mean Oni-chan, you are absolutely right. I'm 3 years older than you.
Nay. Not nay. Nee.
I'm not your One-chan.
The king is kind of girlish, I guess,
one of the ghoul mothers commented.
Like the shape of his head.
You're right. If he had the same skin color as us, you'd never think he was a boy, said another. As ghoul men had the heads of lions, from Bilde and the other mother's perspective, Vandaloo had feminine features and a girl's head. However, it seemed that this did not apply for the undead titans like Borkus or Zran, who had large, robust bodies with beautiful muscles.
Once my voice changes and I hit my second growth period, I'm sure I'll be like them too.
And by the time I'm an adult, I'll have a cleft chin, arms like logs, a broad chest, abdominal muscles like the caterpillar tracks of a tank, and thighs thicker than a woman's waist. I'll definitely be as macho as a Hollywood star. I have the superhuman strength skill that increases my muscle strength, so I'm sure of it. Probably. I hope. Pavina, with the other children riding on her back as if she were a horse, passed happily by Vandaloo as he was feeling strangely insecure about his future self. She was almost 1 year old, but she was already big enough to look 5 or 6. She was currently obsessed with letting the other children ride on her back. She was definitely not showing off her future promise of becoming a muscular individual right in front of Vandaloo. "Come to think of it, what happened with clearing the mid-boss?" asked Bastia.
"Once I'm finished with this break, I'll be going to challenge it for the 6th time,"
replied Vandaloo. Vandaloo had repeatedly lost to the mid-boss on the 20th floor of Borkus's sub-dragon savannah. Of course, it wasn't as if his life was put at risk during these fights. In a fight to the death, he would win, but simply based on the rules he had set, he was losing. He fought the mid-boss one-on-one. This included the restriction of the use of golems created through golem transmutation. On top of that, he was not allowed to use mana absorption barrier to rob the mid-boss of its mobility. The time limit he had set was determined by an hourglass, which took roughly 5 minutes for all of its sand to fall. Vandaloo had fought the Venom Wyvern under these rules 5 times. He couldn't land his attacks on the Venom Wyvern, and even if he did, they were ineffective, and 5 minutes would quickly pass. He had repeated this process several times. Using Disinfect removed the venom inside the Venom Wyvern's body, which meant that he didn't need to worry about being poisoned until it produced the venom again. His impact-negating barrier was more than enough to stop the Venom Wyvern's direct attacks. But Vandaloo's attacks had not been able to deal a decisive blow either. At first, he had tried using the no-attribute spell, Flight, to match his opponent, but he had been completely unable to keep up. If it were just a matter of speed, he would have been able to move faster by simply spending a great amount of mana, But the venom wyvern was far superior when it came to performing tight turns. To begin with, the no-attribute spell Flight was simply a spell that used telekinesis to move the caster's body. It was not a match for the skillful, complicated flying techniques of the venom wyvern that employed the use of wind attribute mana in its wings. And then he had tried to defeat it from a distance. He had tried aiming at it with mana bullets, but this had failed due to their problematic range and projectile speed. At any rate, mana that was not affected by any attribute dispersed easily. The mana bullet spell was a spell that gathered such mana to prevent its dispersion as much as possible. However, there were limits to how much he could prevent it from dispersing. Their range was only several dozen meters normally, and even when Vandaloo poured 10,000 mana into a single projectile, it didn't even last 100 meters. Even using multicast to release multiple mana bullets at the same time had the same result. Their speed was inferior to even arrows, never mind bullets fired from the guns on Earth, and their trajectory was linear, making them very easy to avoid. Dodging them was child's play for the venom wyvern that could fly in any direction at high speeds. Vandaloo had tried methods like twisting the shape of the mana bullet to alter their trajectory, but still none of them had managed to hit. If they did, they had enough destructive power to burst the venom wyvern's flesh and organs, however. In any case, Vandaloo was unable to engage it in close-quarters combat, and mana bullets were ineffective. This meant that he was left with the indirect methods of poisoning it, infecting it with disease, using Soul Break to somehow take its mana away, and distracting it with a Lemure to create an opening. But even when he had managed to get poison created using his deadly poison spell into the venom wyvern's eyes and mouth, it wasn't as effective as it seemed to possess the poison resistance skill. Things had gone well when he had done the same thing with disease, but 5 minutes passed before the disease began to work. Soul Break was a skill that had no effect if Vandaloo couldn't land any physical or magical attacks on the enemy, and since the mana drained by the skill was equal to the amount of damage dealt to the body, he could not drain any of the venom wyvern's mana. Though Lemures had worked on lesser wyverns, the venom wyvern hadn't showed any large openings, despite being surprised by the bloodthirst that the Lemure suddenly produced. And then Vandaloo had remembered his battle against Serkrant and amplified his impact-negating barrier at the moment of the venom wyvern's attack, managing to trap its claws and tail in the barrier and creating an opening for the first time. But before he had managed to move in to attack, it twisted its long neck to bite off the tip of its tail and its trapped paw to escape. It was even more resolute than Serkrant had been. This was not something that even a wild animal would be able to do immediately. It was only its fighting instincts at the mid-boss of a dungeon and the knowledge that it would die instantly if one of Vandaloo's mana bullets struck its torso that allowed it to do this. And after that, the 5-minute time limit passed again. After their battles, Borkus and the others had quickly dealt with the venom wyvern, continued on to defeat the dungeon boss on the 30th floor, and taken the loot in the treasure chamber. This had given him experience and caused him to level up.
"I can definitely win next time,"
said Vandaloo.
"Vandaloo, you don't have to be in such a hurry, you know," said Darcia. "If I'm resurrected 5 years, 10 years, or even 100 years from now, I don't mind." "It's all right," said Vandaloo. "I say this every time, but it'll be all right this time."
Darcia seemed uncertain, but Vandaloo knew he had a chance to win this time. He had gotten an idea for altering the Mana Bullet spell to create a new Death Attribute spell. Vandaloo had thought that Death Attribute magic had limited ways to deal damage directly to enemies, but if there were limited ways, he just had to invent some. He had postponed the invention of such a spell because he didn't gain any experience from defeating enemies himself, but he could devote his efforts to it if necessary. As a result, he had successfully finished developing a new spell yesterday. This spell was a projectile affected by the Death Attribute with long range, high speed, and a difficult-to-read trajectory.
I'll definitely win next time. There will not be a seventh time,
Vandaloo declared confidently. Unlike the regular monsters, mid-bosses and bosses that appeared in the dungeons are produced by the dungeon's core. That is why, no matter how many times a boss is defeated, once a certain amount of time passes, a monster of equal strength appears in its place.
Swash!
7 enormous snake heads, large enough to swallow a cow whole, were coiling around each other. However, there was only one tail. It is one of the dragon races, a serpent with multiple heads. When this creature hatches from its egg, it has 2 heads and is the size of a Japanese rat snake. But the number of heads increases as it develops, as does the size of its body, the hardness of its scales, its regenerative abilities, and the potency of its venom. And once it matures to adulthood, it becomes an enormous 7-headed serpent known as a hydra. It is rank 6, superior to wyverns among the dragon races. Its intelligence is not much different from a normal snake, and it is far less mobile than wyverns. However, its powerful body can mow down a human with ease, and it is difficult to wound through its scales with normal methods. And the substance secreted from its fangs is a potent venom that cannot be removed without a special antidote. And what makes this creature difficult to kill is its resistance that keeps it alive, unless all of its heads are cut off and its heart is destroyed. If only one of these 2 steps are taken, its regenerative ability will allow it to make a full recovery in a matter of days. Incidentally, hydras can develop even further to grow an 8th head, becoming known as an orochi. Its name was no doubt given to it by one of the champions from another world.
I want a rematch,
said Vandaloo, seeing the hydra that had appeared for his 6th attempt at fighting a mid-boss of Borkus's sub-dragon savannah.
No, that is probably impossible,
said Borkus, denying him immediately.
But I just invented a new spell to deal with the venom wyvern's mobility.
The hydra was less intelligent and less mobile than a normal wyvern. Of course, it could not even compare to the higher-ranked version, the venom wyvern.
Well, there's nothing to be done about it,
Borkus told him.
It was actually really unusual that the same monster spawned 5 times in a row as the mid-boss in the first place.
Normally, the race of mid-bosses and bosses that appear in dungeons are not fixed. They tend to be of around the same general strength, but they are generated randomly by the dungeon. This dungeon would generate rank 6 dragon or dinosaur-type mid-bosses. The Venom Wyvern was probably one of the stronger monsters that could have been generated. The reason it had appeared 5 times in a row was due to Vandaloo's bad luck.
It's not like that Hydra's going back down now, said Borkus. Try it out, that new spell of yours.
Sure. Death Bullet.
As Vandaloo lifted a hand towards the Hydra that was raising its curved necks, a black object resembling shimmering hot air appeared in his palm. He fired the death bullet at the Hydra that had sensed some extraordinary presence and was trying to escape. The death bullet consisted of death attribute mana, capable of draining an enemy's life force, condensed using the same principle as the mana bullet. He couldn't fire them consecutively because he still was not used to casting the spell, but their range and speed were on another level. They also had a homing ability that allowed them to chase targets to a certain extent. However, the death bullet's projectile speed and homing ability proved unnecessary as it hit the Hydra with ease. A scream rose from the Hydra as its vitality was drained and its heads began lowering to the ground one by one. Vandaloo fired multiple more death bullets, and once all of its heads were lying on the ground, he fired one last death bullet at its heart to deal the final blow. What remained was the corpse of a Hydra that was dead despite being completely unwounded.
"Oh, that's pretty amazing," said Borkus.
"Considering that the amount of mana I spent was equivalent to an entire mana pool of 100 first-rate mages, not really," said Vandaloo.
"That might be true, but it's less than 1% for you, isn't it? Anyway, you should be happy. You beat a mid-boss in less than a minute. Never mind the 5-minute time limit."
"I did, but—"
"You don't need to be so focused on the Venom Wyvern. The main thing is you just need to become strong enough that the Dragon Golem won't kill you straight away," Borkus reminded him. "Isn't that right?"
"You're right, but I still can't feel satisfied." Still, as Borkus says, clearing this dungeon repeatedly until the Venom Wyvern appears is wandering too far away from my goal, so I guess this will do. The Dragon Golem is next.
The levels of Death Attribute Charm strengthen followers, no attribute magic, mana control, cooking, and unarmed fighting techniques have increased. You have acquired the long-distance control skill.